All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Pleasure to have you joining us for this seminar titled, If Not the Paris Accord, Then What? This seminar is being sponsored by the Garfield Center for Public Leadership here at Hiram. I'm James Thompson, director of the center. And the first question, of course, that we have to address is, what is the Paris Accord? So what is this thing? Anyone want to take a stab at that? We know it's an accord, and an accord indicates agreement. So we know it's an agreement of some sort. Let's start with the second question. That'll be easier. Who sponsored the Paris Accord? You're all here. You must care about this. Who sponsored the Paris Accord? I'll give you a hint. It's an international organization composed of many states. Yeah.
The United Nations?
Right, exactly. It's the United Nations, and the United Nations came up with this idea, sponsored, it's under the auspices of the United Nations, to have something called the Paris Climate Accord. Now, if you're really clever, you'll know the previous UN agreement, which was actually called a protocol, which was sponsored by the UN on protecting the environment. It came out in 2005. Does anyone want to be incredibly, this gentleman again?
Is it Kyoto?
The Kyoto, right, the Kyoto protocol, thank you, all these UN names. So the Kyoto Protocol comes out in 2005, and do you know anything about that?
Wasn't one of its objectives was also to address the levels of CO2 and mitigation of CO2 release?
Yes, okay, that and a variety of things. It was a very set structure of agreements on how countries that sign up to it, to the Kyoto Protocol, would act to deal with this issue of climate change. It was very specific, a lot of different guidelines, benchmarks, etc. The Paris Climate Accord is then now a follow-on to that over a decade later, and it's much less structured. It basically says to states, if you care about the environment, let us know. And by the way, if you want to do something about that, you can also let us know. And why don't you tell us in a sort of, some memorandum or some sort, what you plan to do about that to keep the environment on track and keep the climate from getting too hot. It's a pretty open-ended agreement. So that is what we're talking about today, the Paris Climate Accord. And obviously, given our title, we're not going to do it. What's next? Obviously, something is happening with that. So we're going to explore what it is and why the United States isn't going to follow it, and what are the options in light of that fact. Now, just a few more points. This accord thing, when was it drafted? Anybody know? I'll tell you, it was drafted in 2015. And these are some basics about it. It required ratification or accession by 55 UNFCCC parties. That's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm sure you knew that. Accounting for 55% of global greenhouse gases. So the idea was you'd have these parties sign up, and if a certain number of parties agreed to it, parties being countries, then this thing would be a go. Well, what do you know? It crossed the necessary threshold back on the 5th of October, 2016. And a month later, we then had it enter into force. It became a real thing on the 4th of November, 2016. So essentially, almost exactly a year ago, this thing became real. Next question. How many countries have currently signed the accord? We'll try to get someone new here. Yes, you.
169.
Okay, 169. Any other guesses? Yeah. 89. Any other guesses?
Lower, 55.
Okay, almost, in a sense. And by the way, I liked your number because I think it's a version of what you said. I think it's 196. And so, as opposed to 169. And the United States did sign it under the Obama administration. But the question is, which countries have declared their intent to withdraw? Well, the United States is one of them. President Trump has come out very recently and said that unless things really change, he's going to take the United States out of the accord. Now, what other countries have done that? Devin Jones. To my knowledge, and I could be incorrect about this, I don't think there are any other countries. Do you have a...
Australia did, but they took that back.
Okay, so they're back in. They're right back in. All right, excellent. All right. Just to give you a sense of this significance of the fact that the United States has declared intent to withdraw and how much that does run counter to the global trend, there was one other country that had not yet signed up to it until just recently, and they just signed up. And the big hint is that Lindsay Harris raised her hand, so I'll let her answer. It's on the screen. Lindsay. Syria. You may not know what's been happening in Syria lately if you haven't been paying attention to the news. And I understand you come to college and then you forget everything else that's going on. Syria has been having a little bit of a civil war. And it's been very brutal. And that government, among other things, in the context of that war, has attacked its own population with gas, with weaponized gas, which is to say a country that does that sort of thing has now signed on to the Paris Accord, which gives even a greater contrast, in a sense, to the President of the United States' action to withdraw from this accord. If even the Syrians are on board, why is the United States withdrawing? There are arguably at least 3 ways to think about why the United States might have done this. The first answer would be that it's a sole superpower on the planet. There's only one truly, truly powerful country on this earth, that's the United States, and because it could leave, it chose to do so. That might seem like almost a banal answer, too simplistic, but the truth is that is a very international relations theory kind of answer. We have brought very prominent scholars to Hiram, a guy named John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. Some of you may have been here for his talk, who he would make that kind of argument. He would say that states only bind themselves to agreements if they have to, because they have a power ratio that makes them weak versus other powers that force them into agreements. If you're powerful, you get to break the rules, because in international politics there are no rules. And the United States, being the most powerful, therefore was the state that could most easily get out of this agreement. That is an academically legitimate argument to make, and you could think that way. A second explanation of why the United States is pulling out, or arguing that it's going to pull out, is that the accord is in fact a bad agreement, and that the United States is taking a principled stand in a way that no other country has been willing to do, to say we are not going to support this bad agreement. A third answer would be the one at the bottom, which is that President Trump's particular political proclivities and those of people who are in the same boat as him in terms of their perspective on this thing, elected officials in this country, have decided, because this is what they believe, because this is what their voter base wants, either because their voter base doesn't like climate control or the voter base doesn't like the word Paris or whatever, that they are going to pull the United States out of this agreement. So, out of curiosity, I'd like to do a little vote. If you'd be so kind, raise your hand if you think primarily, not necessarily in total, but in primarily, the first answer is correct. Okay, so that's 0. We could bring John Mearsheimer back. He's a very persuasive man, and by the end of that, at least one of you would think that that was correct. I don't know who you are. You're out there. Okay, raise your hand if you think the second answer is correct, that the accord is actually a bad idea, and there's a good reason to get out of it. Okay. A couple of you. Okay. So raise your hand if you think the third answer. Okay. So I think that won. The third answer, by the way, I didn't anticipate that, the third answer seems like the most obvious. The first answer is sort of abstract theory, and besides, there are other powerful countries, China, India, Russia, who are on board with the accord, so the power argument seems a little problematic. The idea that it's a bad agreement seems potentially problematic because so many states have signed on to it, so can it really be that bad? So the third answer seems pretty attractive. It's also the case that it seems pretty simple. President Trump has demonstrated a lot of idiosyncrasies with regard to how he responds to global trends and initiatives. So him behaving in a certain way because he wants to, because his base likes that, that's a simple answer, and it might be the right answer. And with this topic of the environment, it's very attractive to get the right answer and make it very clear and, if possible, simple, because for a lot of people, this is a topic of great concern. I know a lot of you here tonight are environmental studies majors. So obviously you take this very seriously, and many of us do. I was in Miami back in August, and a few days after I left, it got hit by one of the worst hurricanes to ever make landfall in modern history. I've been on sabbatical in California, in my hometown of Santa Rosa this semester, which just got absolutely nailed by the worst forest fires we've ever seen in California. And when you're close to those sorts of events, you want people to explain to you what the problem is and how you're going to address it. So in particular, that third answer seems really attractive. The truth is, though, that this may not be that simple. This academic assessment of this might not, and by academic I mean sort of the thoughtful, careful, not simply politically based, trying to get votes assessment, might be that this is not that easy to discern what we should do or how we should think about it. When we started in the Garfield program to think about this topic and then decided we're going to do it and we want to get guests to come and represent positions, we wanted to get someone who would be a very strong pro-Paris Accord advocate, and we wanted to get someone who would be a very strong pro-Trump position, anti-Accord person. And we are not environmental experts in the Garfield Center, so we went to the Environmental Studies Department, who are experts, and talked to them about who to start thinking about to bring out. And thanks to them and their guidance as we started to look into this, what we quickly found is that who we would bring out to campus was not going to be a simple question. I thought it would be very easy to find people on either side. And what we found, in fact, is that there were people who were very much in the environmental movement, but their sense of how to think about the Accord was not simply a robust cheerleader for it. And on the other hand, we found people who were maybe opposed to the Accord, but weren't simply against it full bore, but recognized other ways to look at it. And so what we're going to have tonight, and I'm very pleased with this, is I think a nuanced discussion about this topic. What to do with the environmental issue now that the Accord is not likely to be, or potentially likely to be, the framework in which we all work towards environmental solutions. We're going to have two guests who are going to be very properly introduced here in a moment. We're going to have a student come up and give those proper introductions, but just to give you a sense before we get going of how they're approaching this topic in general, we're going to have Mr. Jerry Taylor, who is going to talk about how, and this is what he sent me as a blurb about his perspective, the Paris Agreement encapsulated everything that Republicans have long said they've wanted out of a global climate agreement. Their opposition to the agreement suggests that no meaningful global climate agreement under any terms will ever satisfy conservatives. So he's going to talk about that more. And Professor Jonathan Adler from right down the road at Case sent me this. Neither the Paris Accord nor the CPP, that's a previous environmental policy agreement, represents a particularly sensible approach to the problem of climate change. International environmental agreements are rarely worth the effort involved. More broadly, I don't think focusing on emissions targets or near-term regulatory measures makes much sense. So these gentlemen have issues, topics on which they agree and on which they disagree, and it's going to be up for us to take that nuance and think about it, learn from it, and then hopefully in a sophisticated way move forward as we think about, as responsible citizens, what to do about the issue of climate. Before we get to all of that, one last point. As always, special thanks to a couple people who make the Garfield program happen, and in particular these seminars. Bill Recker, many of you know, is our primary supporter for this and the other activities we engage in. He couldn't be here tonight, but we're always delighted to acknowledge his support. Ted Helmuth, who I saw walk in and is sitting there in the back, is always a wonderful friend of the program, makes these seminars a reality. And Michael Canty, who I believe is either here or will be here tonight, who is also a great supporter. So thank you, gentlemen, for your support, and thank you all for coming. I think this is going to be very interesting. And now we're going to have a Garfield scholar, Mr. Jory Gomes, come on up and introduce our two guests.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's Garfield Center for Public Leadership Fall Seminar. Our speakers this evening are Mr. Jerry Taylor and Professor Jonathan Adler. Jerry Taylor is founder and president of the Niskanen Center, a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C., committed to direct engagement in the policymaking process. Before founding the center in 2014, Mr. Taylor worked at the Cato Institute, another prominent D.C. think tank, for 23 years. At the Cato Institute, Mr. Taylor served as Director of Natural Resource Studies, Assistant Editor of Regulation Magazine, Senior Fellow, and then as Vice President. Mr. Taylor has also worked as Staff Director for the American Legislative Exchange Council's Energy and Environment Task Force. He is an established libertarian voice in energy policy in Washington, having been the author of numerous policy studies, testifying before Congress, and appearing in the Washington Post, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, as well as other distinguished media sources. Our second speaker this evening is Professor Jonathan Adler, the inaugural Johann Verhaage Memorial Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Business Law and Regulation at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Aside from teaching courses in environmental, administrative, and constitutional law, Professor Adler is a prolific author. He has been the author or editor on 7 books, is a contributing editor to National Review Online, and is a regular commentator on myriad radio and television programs. His work has been featured in Harvard Environmental Law Review, Supreme Court Economic Review, and notable media outlets. He has been cited in the U.S. Supreme Court and has testified before Congress a dozen times. Along with these accomplishments, Professor Adler is a senior fellow at both the Center for the Study of the Administrative State at the George Mason University School of Law and the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. He serves on the board of directors for the Foundation for Research on Economics and the Environment, and is also on the advisory boards of the Cato Supreme Court Review, the NFIB Small Business Legal Center, as well as the Environmental Law Institute's Environmental Law Reporter and the Eli Press. He has received awards from Case Western Reserve University Law Alumni Association and the Federalist Society for Law and Policy. Prior to his current work, he has clerked for the Honorable David B. Santel on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia and directed the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Environmental Studies program. Please join me in welcoming tonight's distinguished speakers.
Well, I have the privilege of going first. First of all, thanks for having me and for coming out tonight. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted to see my old friend Jonathan Adler. A little bit of background, which will become apparent as the night goes on. Jonathan and I, both in our younger days, worked on the other side of this issue. I used to come to engagements like this and argue against things like the Paris Climate Accords. I used to argue against the mainstream narratives associated with climate science, and I used to make the argument against emissions reductions to address climate risk. However, my mind changed. So for 23 years, I was a climate skeptic gunslinger at the Cato Institute, but I found out in the course of doing my business that the arguments I was trafficking in could no longer hold. They were falling apart year by year by year until the end point literally came to a position where I could not find a credentialed economist who published in the peer-reviewed literature on this topic who argued against climate action, which is a pretty bracing thing for somebody who works in a think tank. We're not going to talk too much about the economics, at least I'm not going to talk too much about the economics tonight. I'm going to talk mostly about the politics of the agreement, and of course this requires us to delve a little bit into the science. To give you an idea of one of the many reasons that my mind changed on climate, I can tell you this little story. It's not the only reason my mind changed. My mind did not immediately change at that point, but it began, the dominoes that fell was this particular event. I was on TV, and I was debating a scientist named Joe Romm, who's presently at Center for American Progress. Back then he was not, however. And we were on TV talking about climate change. This was maybe 2004, 2005. I don't recall the exact date. Or maybe it was early in the decade, I'm not entirely sure. But I said, look, back in 1988, James Hansen testified in front of the United States Senate and set off the politics of climate change as we know them today. And in that testimony in 1988, James Hansen said that if we continue on a business as usual path, we're going to see a dramatic amount of warming in the future. And he had a line with projections showing where that warming would go. And I said, look, it's been more than a decade. We can now look back at his projection to see how well, we're doing. Was Hansen right or wrong? And it turns out we've only seen less than half of the warming Hansen says we should have seen by now. Really only about a quarter of it. And I said, so this tells you that not the climate change isn't happening, it tells you the models are running hot, the climate's not as sensitive to greenhouse gas emissions as people like James Hansen think, and that this suggests that climate change will be a relatively modest non-event. So we go back into the green room, and Joe turns to me and says, did you ever even bother reading that testimony you just talked about? And I said, look, a long time ago, but this is the narrative of a climate scientist who I happen to know, who was in front of the United States Senate and testified to this effect. And I read the testimony to refresh my memory on this matter. And he says, I dare you, go back to your office and open up Hansen's testimony and read it again. Because strictly speaking, what you said is true. He offered a business as usual scenario that projected more warming than we've seen. So, but he also offered two other scenarios, scenarios B and C, which assumed different emissions profiles and had different temperature projections associated with those different emissions profiles. So now if you go back and look at that, you're going to find that his business as usual scenario, scenario A, assumed far more emissions than we've seen, because we went through a recession only a couple of years later. There was Mount Pinatubo. There are lots of natural variation which put far fewer greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which correspondingly meant far less warming than he predicted. So if you want to yell at James Hansen or something, you yell at him for not being a very good economic forecaster, right? Or not for seeing Mount Pinatubo, which had a global cooling effect for some period of time. So, but if you look at scenarios B and C, with different emissions profiles, assuming climate action of some sort, you'll find that one of those scenarios, scenario B, tracks the emissions that we've seen almost to a T. He said, Jerry, there is a temperature projection associated with that emissions trajectory of scenario B. And it's spot on. And he said, now notice it just took me 5 minutes to explain this to you. I don't have 5 minutes on television to shoot your garbage down. But if you want to be a hack, be a hack. Well, I thought it was the business of beating the best and the brightest, and I was pretty arrogant about my abilities, and I was pretty confident in my position, so I went back to my office and I looked it up. He was right. And as far as I could tell, he was exactly correct. So I went to see my climate skeptic friend, who I had been trusting all these many years, trafficking in his arguments. And I said, what am I missing here? I must be missing something. Turns out I wasn't missing anything. After 20 minutes of having it hauling, the scientist said, look, I'm not James Hansen's attorney, let him explain it. He offered a business as usual scenario that had 3 times more warming than we've really seen. QED, I don't even know why we're having this conversation. That's pretty crazy. From that point forward, I began to do far more due diligence than I had performed on the arguments I was trafficking in. I found a variation of this story playing out again and again and again and again and again. Not always through knowing mendacity. Sometimes it's just bad work. Sometimes it's just cherry-picked data. Sometimes it's a poor representation of the true argument side. But it was that event, and there were a few others like it, I won't bother you because that's not why I'm here tonight, that now has me in a position to argue against my old self. So, let's talk about the Paris Agreement. As noted, I contend that Republicans, with Donald Trump at the helm, have gleefully blown up an agreement that was everything they have long said that they wanted out of international climate talks. Republicans have thus gone from measured resistance to climate action into total unreasoning incoherence. I will discuss these matters and then discuss where I think U.S. policy should go from here. First of all, let's talk about the Paris Agreement. The Republican battle cry in the 1990s and 2000 was that no U.S. climate action was warranted unless developing nations were to sign on. That was their main argument for successfully opposing the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, because not all developing nations had signed on. Only the developed countries made promises to reduce emissions, and since developing nations didn't, neither should we. So their first battle cry was everybody has to sign on, including the poorest of the poor nations. All developing countries had to be part of it. Republicans also looked skeptically on any treaty that might require binding commitments, which conjured up conservative fears of lost national sovereignty, global conspiracy, and one world government. I am not overstating. Agreements in the climate arena which are binding scare the bejesus out of conservatives and libertarians because they think that they will now be held hostage to some international tribunal which can use those promises to restrain American industrial activity, to regulate the United States economy, and that sort of thing. So Republicans have always been extremely hostile to agreements which had binding commitments. That's one of the reasons that the 2009 climate talks in Copenhagen ended in disaster, for that reason alone. Now, most importantly, Republicans have long feared that international climate action was a socialist plot to deindustrialize the West and transfer wealth abroad. Republicans were thus constantly putting the brakes on anything that hinted at serious near-term decarbonization. Bottom line, they didn't believe climate change was a significant problem, and if it did need to be addressed, it should be addressed very, very modestly, very carefully, and very prudently. So, those have long been the Republican position about agreements on the international stage. Well, the Paris Agreement was everything they said they wanted. Every nation on Earth, except for Nicaragua, as Syria has now come on board, as mentioned, pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So even the developing nations are now on board. To preserve national autonomy, pledges were non-binding. Each nation was left to decide on its own how aggressive it wanted to be and how their climate plans would be designed. So it was entirely up to the United States to decide how much emissions reductions they were to seek and exactly how they were going to go about that. And each nation made its own determination both on their goal and their means to the goal. Entirely up to each nation. Finally, the voluntary commitments for global action were modest but meaningful. I say they were modest. In fact, a lot of my environmental friends in Washington, including James Hansen, for instance, who called the Paris Accord bullshit. That was his phrase. This complete bullshit agreement because it doesn't do anything near enough to address greenhouse gas emissions. But they did some. If you look at the emissions if you look at the promises that were made in Paris and assume they were actually executed, we would get about almost halfway in emissions reductions of where we need to be if we're to stay on track to keep climate change from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius, given a doubling of background industrial emissions. All right? So it was a meaningful agreement, but it was a modest agreement. But still, that wasn't enough. The United States and the developing world and the developed world got virtually everything they had long asked for in that agreement. Republicans and the conservatives, however, rejected that agreement on every single one of these grounds, either oblivious to or ignorant of the fact that the Paris Accord was a direct descendant of a template first proposed by George W. Bush in Bali during international climate talks in 2007. The reality is the climate agreement is more or less what George W. Bush put on the table in 2007. In other words, the right is now outraged that nations refuse to make binding commitments in Paris. They say these are voluntary. This is outrageous. They need to be binding. They were outraged the climate plans being forward were sketchy and opaque. Well, some of these climate plans were just aspirational. They needed more detail. Really. They right and conservatives were upset that the promises offered, even if kept, would do little to address climate change and global temperatures. Okay, that's a nice complaint, but normally what I don't hear from conservatives is therefore we need to act more meaningfully. So their complaint was we were acting, too modestly. And they were upset with the fact that every nation on Earth signed the agreement except the aforementioned two, and they used this, and I kid you not, as evidence of a grand international conspiracy to destroy the U.S. economy. The very fact that every nation on Earth agreed was used by Donald Trump and his administration as an argument for why this is a dangerous threat to the United States. So while conservative complaints, except the international conspiracy stuff, have varying degrees of merit, I mean, they're not entirely wrong about a lot of this, it's hard to imagine that conservatives would be happier had the agreement embraced aggressive emissions reductions, or entailed binding commitments, or had hard compliance plans subject to international enforcement. And now if you leaven that with the now standard dose of abject lying which occurred. For instance, we heard on and on and on from Republicans after the election that the United States made hard commitments in Paris and no one else did. No, we didn't. Our commitments were just as voluntary, just as crafted by our own negotiators, and just as subject to being ignored as anyone else's. Many of them, in fact, are fairly ambitious in this regard. China, for instance, has moved from a skeptical actor on climate change to one of the most ambitious and aggressive actors on climate change for reasons we can talk about during the Q&A and discussion, if you like. But the bottom line is international agreements are always going to be problematic because there's no international body that can conceivably enforce any agreements. And there are an infinite number of ways in which one might chop up a single nation's obligations to address climate change, and none of which will be satisfactory to other actors. So it's my contention that if we're going to act, we will need to act unilaterally. But we want to act unilaterally in a fashion that encourages other nations to do likewise. Because it is absolutely true that if the United States acts and no one else acts, that the effect on future climate is relatively trivial to non-existent. We need global action. We're probably not going to get it through agreements like this. So what I embraced in this canvass, or what I have given to argue, is that the United States should impose a carbon tax on itself. A tax that is robust enough to meet our commitments, or what would be our share of responsibility in holding climate change to going no higher than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That kind of a carbon tax would probably be somewhere like a $40 or $60 carbon tax, increasing it somewhat above the rate of inflation over time. The reason that I hold this line is that with a policy like this, if you had a trade regime which taxed imports that might reflect their carbon content from nations which are not addressing climate change or not involved in carbon pricing, and you allowed rebates to U.S. manufacturers who compete abroad, so that they're not disadvantaged in international markets by paying high prices for greenhouse gas emissions when other actors aren't paying very high prices, then you set up a situation where international actors would now entertain their own carbon taxes. Because after all, if you're an exporter to the United States and you're not pricing carbon, well, you're being priced at the border. You're relying on the U.S. market, and that money, which otherwise might have gone to your treasury, is going to the United States treasury. So you have every incentive, if you're an active global participant in the U.S. economy, to consider a carbon tax, simply because it's a big market, it's already being imposed. The only issue is which treasury gets the money.